I don't know if you saw the video with James Carden over the last week, a former State Department official and advisor on Ukraine. He did an interview with Sky News Australia, actually.
I did see that interview. I have the clip for it. Yeah.
He was asked, about the situation, and he threw the reporters' propaganda back in their face and said, it's exactly the opposite, right? Russian forces aren't exhausted. Russian forces aren't anything. Russian forces are strong and getting stronger. And he ascertained that the kill ratio was 36-1 in Russia's favor. And I was floored, right? Because I find it hard to believe that number. I can believe that in certain situations it reaches 8-1 or 10-1 even, but 36-1? I mean, wow.
I don't know where he got that number from. I was wondering where he got it from myself.
I have to say that still, without some kind of corroboration, I don't believe that number, but I can't completely discount it either, because he is a serious individual. He's not a pro-Russian, propagandist or even enthusiast or whatever. And anyway, I think we can ascertain that the kill ratio is now simply absurd. And the Russian forces are, progressing at the pace that they are with a war of attrition, only to keep their own casualties down so long that that they can keep this conflict up indefinitely if necessary. If at some point down the road NATO joins directly, I think that's always been a consideration by them, and we see the hysteria even now. I mean, when you come down to it, Russia is still finishing up Donbass. I mean, Pokrovsk is only some 30 kilometers from Donetsk city, right, where this all started out. And you hear the desperation in the hysteria in the West right now, with, being willing to at least consider, even if for the moment they have put aside the possibility of transferring Tomahawks, which was always problematic with launchers and U.S. personnel being needed and everything. But we saw the resumption of Storm Shadow strikes deep within Russia. And just over the weekend, U.S. forces in Ukraine, Trump was striking a dam in Belgorod, a reservoir dam that would cause, it's already causing some flooding, but if it is completely destroyed, then there's no military utility to it, right? It's simply spite, lashing out because their forces are so in such a desperate situation. It would only cause the loss of lives of civilians and damage to civilian infrastructure, buildings, homes, that sort of thing. And HIMARS we've seen that repeatedly, and we know from New York Times reports that every HIMARS strike cannot occur without the targeting, the guidance data, the satellite data, and the green light from the U.S. Every single HIMARS strike. We're not even talking ATACMS, right? We're just talking a regular using a guided launch missile. And that means that Trump, for all intents and purposes, is lashing out by hitting a dam in the Belgorod region to this situation. And, Russians don't like that. But ultimately, it is desperation. There's nothing else to say about that. And the fact that they resort to this is another sign of why Russia cannot let this regime stay in power at the end of this conflict. that they need to remove this entire regime and remove U.S. influence from U.S. and European influence from Ukraine in its entirety, because there can't be any settlement with that.
I would like to point out that I think it was several weeks ago that you and I were talking, and I said the map looked as if there was a mass encirclement that was taking place. Now, it may not have been a mass encirclement, but it did. But as you point out, all of these areas seem to be falling within like back to back, back to back.
Yeah. No, what you were talking about is a complete encirclement. You were talking a physical encirclement of everything, of the entire defensive line. And I pointed out that the manpower requirements for that would simply be prohibitive. And I told you that an operational encirclement of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk was possible at some point down the road if supply lines were cut, but that area was so big that, even with Russia's advantage, that the manpower requirements. And what we're seeing is not one big encirclement, but now we're seeing each of these urban areas being first flanked in pincher movements, and eventually having their supply lines first operationally cut. And now in both of these cases, they're facing actual physical encirclement. But the manpower requirements from that are considerably less than encircling the entirety of the Donbass with troops. So
it's not like a World War II.
Simply the militaries involved are not of that scale. And it must be said, whatever there's so much Western propaganda about Russian troops and Russian losses, from the very beginning, fighting with shovels, running out of this, running out of that, no morale, no training, right? Lives thrown away in what do they call it? Human wave attacks.
Right.
All of it could not be further from the truth. The Russian, the Kremlin is extremely concerned with minimizing Russian casualties, right? They said again, Putin said again over this weekend, no artificial timelines, right? No political deadlines, right? The goal is the destruction of the Kiev regime's military first and priority, but that Russian troop losses must be minimized. And that is to keep the support of Russian society, the morale of the Russian forces up. And yes, it's slow and grinding and methodical, but there's also no answer to it. And I understand there is a great deal of frustration from a certain segment of Russian sympathizers in the West that believe that it's simply not going fast enough for their Hollywood expectations and their Call of Duty experience.
To be fair to them, because I've spoken to some of them. I haven't had the opportunity to speak to Dr. Rowe, but I have spoken to some people who it's not about the Hollywood thing. From their point of view, they're looking at it as a black swan event, as you would call it. Meaning, the longer that this goes on, the more opportunity there are for either false flags, the more opportunity there is for something to take place. Meaning, yes, I think you're right that Putin is concerned about loss of life, but I think they're also concerned. Medvedev, in fact, pointed out when the Budapest summit fell apart, Medvedev gave a very long statement. And in the statement, he pointed out, he says, well, now that negotiations are over with, we can go after various people who are in, let's say, secretive hideouts that we want to go after. Okay, well, that kind of implies that part of Russia's rationale for also with this kind of war of attrition without going, let's say, heavier in Ukraine to try to end the war faster had to do with also wanting negotiations. I mean, it could be a combination of both, I suppose, but that's according to Medvedev.
Yeah. It has to be said, we haven't seen that yet. I mean, again, the argument there is removing the Kiev regime's political leadership. Let's say that we know that the Kiev regime has tried multiple times, according to Budanov, right? The Kiev regime's, genocidal, I like the dark military intelligence chief. He said several times they've tried to kill Putin. They just have never succeeded, right? So why doesn't Russia return. And that's simply because Zelensky is an ineffective and incompetent clown. And Sierski is only, one step removed from that and has his position simply because he is 100% politically loyal to Zelensky and clicks his boots and jumps how high when Zelensky asks how much. And as far as the Russian side is concerned, that if they took these people out, they would just be replaced, right? It is a regime. It is not a handful of individuals, right? I mean, I know the U.S. loves to believe and portray every crisis situation in the world as the resort of one demonized individual, be that Putin or Gaddafi or Hussein or Assad or anything like that. The cartoon puerile vision, American vision of the way the world works. Well, Russia recognizes that's not the way the world works. And taking out Zelensky and Sierski would threaten, replacing them with someone more competent and capable than they are, which is not that hard to up the bar in them. And I really do believe that's the reason why they haven't taken them out, simply because they would put someone more capable in that office. They're quite happy with Zelensky's insanity and even intransigence, because there are certainly some people within the Kremlin that believe the opposite, that the greatest opportunity for a black swan event would occur with Russian casualties climbing to a much higher degree through pushing it too fast, and that might provoke a Western response. Right. Mm-hmm. Whereas by moving incrementally and methodically, that is the equivalent of a normal Western tactic that is called salami slicing or incrementalism. And as long as they keep turning the heat on the pot up slowly, that the frog that is the West will not notice it until, all of Ukraine is done. That's a counter argument that I'm sure is being presented in one form or another in the Kremlin, and that ultimately is what they have gone with. That being said, with the crumbling that we're seeing at the Kiev regime, inevitably the Russian military is now moving faster than they were 3 months ago, than they were 6 months ago, than they were a year ago. And that pace is only going to increase. Now, obviously, it still won't be fast enough for some people. And I certainly have had my criticisms with the Russian military, over the course of, since 2014, and the choice, which Putin has admitted was a mistake, of not sending Russian troops in back in 2014, 2015. Of believing that there was the possibility of political reconciliation with, the Kiev regime, but primarily the West. And he's admitted that. And also, when the Russian intervention first began, I immediately, once I realized how small the Russian intervention force was, I said, mistake, mistake, mistake. Sure enough, it appears that it was, unfortunately, that it ended up so. But I am certainly not going to armchair quarterback around what the Russian Ministry of Defense is doing. Their slow and steady wins the race is winning. It has depleted, it has demilitarized much of NATO's military potential. Right, certainly in the capabilities of a land-centric war. Right, they've simply exhausted artillery shells, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, everything. But more than that, there's also a diplomatic and a narrative value to all of this. By playing the game the way it's being played, that keeps the rest of the world outside of the West on side, at the very least, not on the West side. They see Russia as acting professionally, and Putin as acting as a statesman at every step in this process. right? And we may get frustrated when he treats diplomatically with Trump, and I certainly do. But I also recognize that he seems like he's the only adult in the room for one reason, because he's the only adult in the room, and I put myself in that category sometimes. So
yeah, I don't know how he does it. I swear, man, I don't know how he does it. I would. Those are not my instincts. My instincts would be wrong.
It must be said, it's not just Trump. I mean, Putin treats every world leader that way, right? That is the behavior, the political culture that Putin has asserted. You can say it draws from the Soviet Union, and I think there's a degree of truth there. But even Macron, whom it is quite obvious that Putin really despises, has utter contempt for, he still couches his barbs at Macron in varying degrees and layers of civility and smiles as he does so. You have to really know Putin to know what is underneath that, and that is simply behavior. For everything else, there's Medvedev, right? And before Medvedev, it was Zhirinovsky. But now that Zhirinovsky has left us, and many people in Russia are going back over many of his videos, his claims, his predictions. Of course, they always cherry pick the ones that were the ones
accurate,
that came through, rather than all of the other clownish stuff he said as a Russian. I think it's fair. I mean, he wasn't necessarily so much in the ethnic terminology, but he was a Russian nationalist of the highest degree. And now it has, whether it has been decided to rebrand Medvedev or whether he has had a Damascene conversion along the way from his previous flirtation with the West when he was Russian president for 4 years and so on, 5 years actually. Anyway, he's the bad cop. He's the designated anger management translator, and what he says is not necessarily the Kremlin's official position, but is often indicative of the arguments that are occurring within the Russian Security Council, shall we say, of the extreme end of that. And I believe there's a purpose to, it's not incidental that Medvedev says this stuff. He's putting out a Russian maximalist position that is not only for the Russian domestic political audience, but it is for the Western political elite. So to know where Russia could take things if they don't, have some type of self-reflection and a return to sanity, which they frankly don't appear capable of. So,
yeah, I take Medvedev as being an honest voice. I just take him as, it's. I don't believe for a moment that Medvedev is a rogue actor or random. I take it's not like he's saying something that's different. I mean, Putin may have put it in different political language, but Medvedev just, he sounds like this is what they're really thinking. Putin is couching it in certain language, but this is what they're really thinking. That's why I always take Medvedev.
And again, part of that is the Russian president will remain professional in all ways, in all rhetoric, all circumstances. But that is not the requirement of the deputy chair of the National Security Council. And if you still want to consider him, there's still no one who represents Putin's wingman and understudy. Whether Medvedev ultimately succeeds Putin or not, he's still Putin's wingman. I mean, that's perfectly clear, and still has, as deputy chair of the Security Council and head of the Russian military-industrial complex, well, at least portions of it, he still obviously has an incredibly important position right
now. When these locations fall, Seversk, Kramatorsk, Seversk, Kupiansk,
Konstantinovka,
right? When those fall, and Kramatorsk is effectively alone,
Yeah.
they are going to lose thousands of people just before they even get the